When you think of the most glamorous period in history, the luxury of the 1930s seems to be the first that springs to mind. Evening soirees of flowing cocktails, rakish women dressed in the opulent flapper dresses of the day, exuding timeless elegance, and dapper men in coattails lazily puffing on cigars. A picture of a time in history where things were changing in society at a rapid rate. In the post-First World War landscape, women were making their way out from under the shadow of men for the first time in the eyes of society, and finally living the lives they had been eagerly eyeing from the sidelines. This newfound freedom meant the first generation of women out of corsets in over a century were embracing everything life threw at them, and being the creators of their own destiny, seeking new and exciting adventures, and having lives that didn't entirely depend on men. However, alongside the independence and enjoyable excesses of drinking, dancing and music came a dark side. For one well-renowned pianist and composer, her boredom with her marriage and the controlling behaviour of the men who surrounded her led to her seeking escapism from her situation. A move which would lead to her downfall, creating a love triangle which would ultimately end in two sides collapsing. Today on Macabre London, we uncover the story of the Rattenbury murder at the Villa Madeira. Everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Macabre London. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with the silent G, and today I'll be taking you on a journey down another of London's grimy backstreets to uncover a macabre tale from the city's past. And this time, we're jet-setting all over the place and settling in the unlikely town of Bournemouth on the south coast. But don't worry, we won't be straying from London for too long, as this story culminates in a trial which takes the Old Bailey by storm. But first, if you're new here and you want to see more videos where we deep dive into historic tales from London's past and sometimes all over the world, then please don't forget to subscribe or follow so you never miss a new episode. If you like what I make and have done for a while now, I would love for you to get more of the show by checking out my Patreon page. There's my extra podcast, which is exclusive to Patreon, called Having a Problem, which is a fun mix of history and real-life chat where we try to get to the bottom of a supposed problem every time. We've done previous episodes on Greek gods, sharks, school, and even spiders, plus loads more.
Dennis Hopper in Apocalypse Now plays a journalist who's absolute liability and on drugs all the time. Said method doesn't quite do justice to Dennis Hopper's behaviour on the set of Apocalypse Now. The actor's drink and drugs lifestyle made him Marlon Brando's enemy number one, forcing Francis Ford Coppola to shoot their scenes on alternate nights.
Oh dear.
Hopper was so into drugs by this point that for his cameo as a madcap photojournalist, he subsisted on a diet of Benzedrine, marijuana and good old-fashioned LSD.
Oh, that doesn't sound like it would be really not beneficial at all for being on set.
It's beneficial for having a bloody good time.
Yeah, having a great time.
There's a whole back catalogue of them now, and they're all around 45 minutes to over an hour long too, and you can sign up for less than a cup of coffee. It really is the best way to support what I make to make sure the show can continue, so why not take a look on patreon.com/Macabre London. I'd love to see you over there. Our story starts today, a long way from London, over 4,500 miles away in fact, in British Columbia in Canada. In the lobby of the Empress Hotel, two people would be introduced to each other, and within moments their lives would be changed forever. This chance encounter would become a fateful pairing, one which would cause many a problem for not only themselves, but those around them for over a decade. Alma Pakenham, an accomplished pianist and composer, had just finished a recital within the hotel, and she was relaxing in the lobby. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw an older, distinguished-looking man, handsome and intriguing to behold. The pair were soon introduced to each other via a mutual friend, and before long they were chatting away like they'd known each other an entire lifetime. It also can't have done any harm that the man Alma was talking to was Francis Mawson Rattenbury, and the hotel lobby they were standing in, he'd designed. Rattenbury was responsible for creating a swathe of buildings across Victoria, the capital of British Columbia, including the law courts, the Parliament buildings, and the hotel the two were now standing in. However, Francis wasn't a Canadian at all. Born in York in the north of England, he'd made his way over to Canada in 1892 to seek his fame and fortune as a young architect in a country which was rapidly expanding its cities. Back in the UK, the competition in the architecture field was incredibly strong, and to make a name for himself, Francis knew he would need to go somewhere where the opportunities would be more plentiful and also open to a wider crowd. He submitted designs for Victoria's Parliament buildings into an open competition and won the bid, and before long his skills would be utilised in creating the most important building in the whole of the capital. Interestingly, when Francis spoke about his qualifications to deliver such a project, he cited that he'd been trained under the eye of Henry Lockwood, the architect who had built pretty much the whole of Bradford and its infrastructure. But by this point, the Parliament buildings were $400,000 over budget and the project was running over by months. So seemingly the same calculator was used to work out that Lockwood died when Francis was just 11 years old, meaning his claims to have been trained by him were entirely false, but it was too late to back out now. Despite this being 25-year-old Francis's first commission, the building did end up turning out to be arguably one of the most impressive of them all in Victoria once it was completed, 6 years later after the first foundation was laid. And soon his reputation and skill preceded him, gaining him work all around Canada. For a good long while, things were good for Francis. He integrated himself into the burgeoning social scene of Victoria and Vancouver, working and equally playing hard. It was as part of this social scene he met Florence Nunn, better known as Florrie. Florrie was said to be kindly and forgiving to Francis, who was known to be rather difficult to get along with. After just a couple of months of courting, the pair were hastily married in 1898, the same year the Parliament buildings were completed, and just a few months later, their first child, Francis Jr., was born. This shotgun wedding bonded the pair in a very short amount of time, and the fun dalliances of a few months had resulted in them now having to be together with a child for the foreseeable future, whether they liked it or not. However, they managed to do okay for a while and added a second child, Mary, to the family in 1904. Perhaps as a way to distract himself from his huge mistake, he threw himself into his work. He invested in several businesses when his architecture work was drying up as a result of World War I, and he diversified into gold mining, cattle driving, and other building investments. When he gambled a lot of his money on a new building company, Francis was convinced he was going to be set for life. But not soon after the deeds and contracts were signed, the owner went on holiday on a little boat named the Titanic. And guess what was in his pocket? So, just like that, Francis had lost a huge amount of his fortune, along with his new business partner, and this, of course, put a huge strain on his marriage, which, much like the Titanic, was also heading for an iceberg. Along with the Titanic in 1912, Florrie and Francis were also doomed to break apart. However, they didn't go quietly. The pair had a bitter separation, which began first with 8-year-old daughter Mary passing notes between them both as they decided to stop speaking. That's a good way to create some trauma there, well done Rattenburys. And the two warred for a number of years, sleeping in separate rooms and barely having anything to do with each other. After a series of reconciliations and then being on again, off again for another 11 years, Francis had become quite the bitter drinker. He was seeking solace away from the home, all the while Florrie was trapped with 2 growing children. This stalemate of a relationship was only going to last for so long until something had to give. Enter stage right Alma Pakenham, the catalyst in breaking the pair apart for good. But before that happened, Florrie would put up a serious fight. Born Alma Wolfe in 1898 to a gold prospecting family, her father left the family for reasons unknown, and her mother remarried, changing her surname to Clark. Alma picked up the piano at an early age and was a child prodigy, securing a space within the Toronto Symphony Orchestra as a soloist when she was just 17. A year previously, at the age of just 16, she had married her first husband, Irish-born Caledon Robert John Radcliffe Dolling, who was 12 years her senior at 28 years old. The pair rushed into marriage in 1914 as World War I had just broken out, and as Caledon enlisted straight away, being placed in the Fusiliers, the two decided tying the knot was a good idea. By the following year, he'd progressed sufficiently through the ranks and was stationed in France. Alma followed in order to be close-ish and went to work in the London War Office. Over the next year, Caledon was injured twice in the line of duty, and sadly, by 1916, he died at the Battle of the Somme. This left a devastated Alma, a widow at the age of just 24 years old. But this spurred Alma on to become a larger part of the war effort, where many others would have shied away. After being issued with a widow's pension, Alma was set for a number of years and didn't have to work, so instead she began volunteering. She threw herself into the most harrowing of situations by volunteering at a field hospital in France and was soon close to the front line. When she wrote to a friend back home, she said she was fine with listening to the bombing at night, but the rats nibbling at her feet did bother her somewhat. After sustaining 2 injuries herself from falling shrapnel, she ended up returning to England in January of 1918, just a few months before the war would draw to an end. Just a matter of weeks after returning to England, she met a journalist who had also been a soldier during the war, Compton Pakenham. Compton was only 5 years older than her, and the pair bonded instantly over their shared war experiences. However, there was a slight snag in the fact that Compton was married. However, the relationship wasn't a happy one, and despite the legalities, Compton and his wife had been separated a short time after their marriage. In fact, he'd not even stuck around to see the birth of their daughter, as his wife Phyllis chucked him out of the house, saying he revealed himself to be an unsatisfactory choice. Compton courted Alma for 2 years before going through an official divorce so he could marry his new fiancée. Phyllis willingly agreed, and Alma was cited as the official reason for the pair's final separation. Once the divorce was finalised, Compton proposed to Alma and they emigrated to New York, where Compton got a job at the New York Times. The pair were then married the following year in 1921. Not long after, their first and only child, a baby boy, who was named after his father, would be born. But things weren't to last, and just the following year, the pair separated, and Compton Jr. and Alma made their way back to her homeland of Canada. The divorce between Alma and her estranged husband wouldn't be finalised until a further 3 years had passed in 1925. Now a single mother, Alma had a difficult time of juggling family life and her job, but the fact that she had family in Canada she could rely on to help with childcare meant she could go back to her first love, the piano. Alma once more became the musician du jour and a darling of the Canadian music scene, and also taught piano at home as she could have Compton Jr. nearby as she did so. At one time, she had performed all over the country as part of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, but as time passed and she needed to be around more for her son, she focused more on her composing, writing under the pseudonym Lausanne, composing many popular tunes from the time. When she and Francis first made eyes at each other across the crowded lobby of the Empress Hotel in 1923, she'd been doing just that, giving a recital of her own music, whilst other skilled performers sang her songs alongside other popular tunes from the day. This starlet caught the eye of Francis, who was also known as Rats to his friends, and the pair were introduced to each other. The sparks flew instantaneously, but this was an unlikely pairing. The distinguished and dashing Rats was a darling of the architectural scene and just so happened to be 30 years her senior. However, Alma was taken with him and fell obsessively head over heels in love. Again, much like with her second husband, Francis was also married. In fact, Rats had married Florrie the year Alma was born. This didn't stop the new couple, however, and despite flaunting this new relationship incredibly publicly, showing off Alma at parties and soirees, Florrie refused to divorce Francis. It took a 2-year bitter battle where Francis turned to vicious tactics to force his wife to agree to the uncoupling. He began taking Alma back to the family home where they would canoodle in front of her and go to bed together in the same house. Luckily, by this point, the couple's 2 children, Francis Jr. and Mary, were both grown up and had moved out of home. Alma herself was just a year older than his eldest child, Frank. Francis thought this brazen and hurtful tactic of parading Alma in front of her would work to get Florrie to agree to the divorce they needed in order for them to get married, but she held on in there, bitterly fighting for finances, which she knew she wouldn't be privy to. Florrie had been a dedicated and selfless wife, staying at home with the children and raising them into fully grown adults, whilst Francis agreeably did work hard, but he was an absent and neglectful father and husband. Eventually, this behaviour escalated to Francis turning off the gas supply and electricity in the family home. And this act of cruelty, paired with the public humiliation he was putting her through, reluctantly led to Florrie signing the divorce papers. It's not known if she received any money from the Rattenbury fortune, but over the course of the following months, Rats found himself increasingly left out of business meetings he would have at one time been invited to, and the once frequent contracts he'd been fortunate enough to have lavished upon him started to dwindle. In the hopes his bad behaviour might be forgotten, Francis moved out of Victoria for almost 2 years, returning in 1927. During this time, Alma had their first and only child, John. But everyone in Victoria still remembered the name of Rats when he returned, and as such, the whole city had blacklisted him. With his prospects decreasing and the whole of Victoria slowly starting to push him out of their inner circle, Francis had no other option than to leave the city. However, he didn't just decide to move elsewhere in Canada. No, he went back to his homeland of England. But before we join the Rattenburys on the south coast, let's pause to hear a word from today's sponsor, London Nootropics. Now, over the last couple of months, I just completed a 4-part series on the suffragettes, all whilst working a 9-to-5 job, which, to be honest, was not a particularly smart thing to do because it meant I had no time for anything else, and it also meant my brain was completely fried by the end of it. Was it one of the best things I've made so far? I like to think so, but did it require 110% of my brain power after a full day of work? It sure did. So here is where London Nootropics really came to my rescue. I wrote every episode you heard of that series whilst drinking their delicious adaptogenic coffee. Their 3 different blends, Flow, Mojo and Zen, all make for an extremely balanced workday, one which will see you use all your hours productively. Flow is a blend with rhodiola and lion's mane mushrooms, which help you unlock your flow state. Mojo, which is great for when you start to have that mid-morning slump, is packed with Siberian ginseng and cordyceps mushrooms to give you some pep in your step, and it's also great as a pre-workout boost. Then there's Zen, which will keep you going in those post-lunch hours when everything feels too tough to accomplish. With soothing ashwagandha and L-theanine, it will get you into a calm focus that will see you right through all those pesky tasks you've been putting off for the rest of the day. London Nootropics coffee is a real game changer for me. I find it really does help me get through my to-do list for the day without that hyperactive feel of regular coffee, and I can't be without it. It's a real hero product of mine and I absolutely adore it. So I'm really pleased to say London Nootropics have hooked me up with a lovely discount code just for the Ghoul Gang, so you can try it out and see what you think. Just head to londonnootropics.com and use the code Macabre at checkout to get 20% off your order. I personally have a subscription because that also gets you money off, and I find that the longer I've been drinking their adaptogenic coffee, the better the results are for me. But equally, if you just want to give it a go, they do one-off boxes too. I have a mixed box subscription which is £24 a month and it's worth every penny. So if you're looking to elevate your day and start on your adaptogenic journey, then head to londonnootropics.com and don't forget to tell them I sent you by using the discount code Macabre, that's MACABRE, at checkout for your exclusive 20% off. And if you do, let me know. I know you're going to love it and I want to know how you find it. Now, let's get back to the episode. Alma and Francis Rattenbury had decided to move to Bournemouth, a sleepy seaside cliff town in the south of England. This quiet suburban idyll was very similar to what the pair had known in Victoria, except with much worse weather. And after a mere 6 months of travel, stopping along the way for short periods of time, the Rattenburys took up residence in a modest home on Bournemouth's East Cliff. Number 5 Manor Road, named the Villa Madeira, was in a residential area. An urban tree-lined street, a modest home but large enough for all 3 Rattenburys. Alma's son, Compton, who now went by his middle name Christopher, and 2 live-in servants. The Art Deco house was not palatial by any means, but it was a nice big family home, the type of which still dot the south coast of England to this day. Now, of course, running a household along with 2 staff doesn't come cheap, and it wasn't long before Francis was counting the pennies. Growing older, and now in a place where his name wasn't as recognised, Rats was becoming worried about money. Alma, who was busy pursuing her musical career and succeeding, was finding that even though she was doing well, the paychecks weren't up to much, and so Francis began to worry. These financial concerns began to put a strain on their marriage, and Alma found herself starting to realise the age gap between her and Rats was just that. They were at entirely different stages in their lives. Alma was growing into her career and blooming into her full potential, and yet Rats was winding down. He'd lived his life all before Alma came along. But they didn't get to celebrate each other's successes because neither of them were emotionally ready to time travel around each other's lives. Alma was about to get it all, and Rats had already had it. Both feeling disconnected from each other and isolated from the lives they'd built back in Canada, the loneliness soon turned to resentment, and both turned to coping mechanisms to deal with the beginning of the end of their relationship. Firstly, they began sleeping in separate beds, Rats sunk into nightly drinking, Alma began taking some prescribed by her doctor pharmaceuticals, and the intimacy they once shared had stopped. Eventually, though, Francis became indifferent and knew the day would come when he would have to set Alma free. But divorce was not something either of them could face again. So instead, they agreed they would live their lives under the same roof, but Alma was told by Rats to live her life. At this time, Christopher, Alma's son, was at boarding school, but the Rattenburys' own son, John, was at a school a short walk away from the home, which he went to and from on his own. However, the next stage of school was a drive away, and Alma was too busy with work to take him, and so Francis suggested hiring a handyman/chauffeur to take the boy to and from school. Placing an advert in the Bournemouth Daily Echo, which read, "Daily willing lad, 14 to 18, for housework, scout train preferred." The Rattenburys soon had a knock at their door by a respectable boy of 17 who fit the bill. George Percy Stoner, a local boy who'd been working at a nearby garage, was able to drive, knew a few handicrafts, and was a useful addition to the household. Stoner rapidly became ingratiated into the family home, and Alma, within 2 months, had moved him into the spare room. By this time, it was obvious that Alma's intentions were not pure, and she lavished the young boy with attention, buying him gifts and spending a lot of time with him. This grooming behaviour led to George and Alma becoming romantic, and even though he was of age, the power dynamic, age gap of 21 years, and the obsessive nature of the relationship was all a bit off. Alma didn't try at all to hide the relationship from Francis, and even if she did, she had fallen head over heels in love with George, and she couldn't hide her feelings, and neither could the teenager. It seemed that Francis's actions of many moons ago when he first started courting Alma had come round full circle, and she was now giving him a taste of his own medicine. Perhaps this was a futile attempt at trying to gain some interest back from the ageing and depressed rats, a way to bring a jealous spark to their marriage, but instead things would only go downhill from here. As things only became more intense with young George, Alma was now spending all of her time with him. She would spend a lot of time composing at home, barely getting dressed, and George ferried John to and from school. The pair took a short holiday to London, and whilst there, Alma showered George with the type of affection she must have been yearning from Francis. When they returned back to the Villa Madeira, Francis was maudlin. He spoke seriously with Alma and said he didn't think he should be around much longer and should leave her to live her life. Rats had also sank further into alcoholism and was now making his way through a bottle of whiskey every day, and he was edging closer to death, regardless of if he chose to speed up the process or not. Now, racked with guilt over what she'd been doing to the poor old man, Alma had a quick change of heart and decided to cool things off with George. The type of distancing which was only going to be taken poorly from a teenage boy whose first ever girlfriend was jilting him for a man who was almost in his 70s. Not having the wisdom that comes from age, George, who was now 18, didn't understand that this was a situation that he should have stayed well clear of from day one. But equally, Alma had roped the boy in to use him to win back her husband, whether she realised this or not. Needless to say, the vibe at the villa was well and truly ruined. The house had 3 residents in a bitter love triangle, the reliant axes of which were all going to fall in on each other. To try and calm the situation and to revive Francis somewhat, the decision was made to make a short family trip to the countryside. Alma, in a huge misstep, asked George if he could chauffeur the pair there, but George was jealous and terrified that this would be the last he would see of Alma, and his heart was broken. The next night, Alma tried to smooth things over with George and invited him round for supper and said they could spend the night together in the spare room. As George climbed into bed with Alma, the two were wrapped in each other's embrace when Alma heard the sound of someone making a low, pained groan. The sound which carried up the staircase was coming from the living room. Alma had left Francis reading when she had gone up to bed. His room was on the ground floor, and her bedroom upstairs meant she could easily go to George's room undetected. Alma quickly got out of bed, ran downstairs, and to her horror saw Francis slumped in his armchair. His face was dripping with blood. Confused as to what had happened, she called to George for help and they moved him into his bed. Francis was unconscious and not responding, but Alma called for help from the live-in housemaid, Irene, and asked her to call for help. It was obvious to Alma what had happened, and Stoner, even though he initially didn't confess to the crime to Alma, was the one and only person that could have and would have committed this crime of passion. Francis had been hit multiple times on the back of the head with a wooden mallet. Alma would a few days later manage to get George to confess to her that he had indeed travelled to his grandparents' house that same evening to retrieve the weapon before returning to carry out the act. Jealous George had wanted Francis dead. To him, he was the only thing that stood in the way of him and Alma being together exclusively. And in his naivety and irrational thinking, he figured the only way to do this was to kill rats. However, he'd not quite succeeded. Francis, in his bed, was still alive, and now it was a matter of time to see if this would switch from assault to a murder case. Alma, who was in shock, decided to steady her nerves with a huge glass of whiskey. She downed the entirety of the glass and began coming up with an alibi of what had happened. When police arrived, she first told them that Rats must have fallen and hit his head on the piano in a drunken stupor, and that George had found him when he arrived at the villa, as she was upstairs in bed and didn't hear anything. But she soon changed her story, saying that Francis himself had tried to kill himself with a mallet. Eventually, however, she settled on telling police that she was the one that had done it after being goaded by him. She'd tried to kill Francis after he'd tried to kill her first. She then tried to bribe a policeman and also offered her services to him, trying to kiss him before she was rejected and a doctor was called to calm her down. Before this confused series of confessions, Alma had been visited by her regular doctor who had issued her with a dose of morphia, and as such, he told the police none of these confessions should be taken seriously, as she was, in no uncertain terms, off her face. But at this stage, as Rats was wheeled out of the Villa Madeira and to a nursing home to try and remedy his injuries, it wasn't murder, so as such, Alma wasn't arrested. However, 4 days later, on March the 28th, 1935, Francis Mawson Rattenbury would die as a result of the attack. This was now a murder case, and during this time, George had told Irene, the housekeeper, that he had indeed been the one to carry out the fatal blows to the victim. George had also confessed to Alma, but racked with guilt, she went to the police station and told officers she was the murderer of her husband, Francis Rattenbury. But police had their suspicions, and also verbal evidence from the housemaid that George too had been the one to do it. Just to be certain, both Alma and George were arrested, and so began the subsequent trial. The press had an absolute field day with the story, which was a gift to them. It had sex, scandal, 2 publicly known characters, and a brutal murder. It was everything they needed to write sensational articles about the case. The trial was covered closely in the papers, and people in their hundreds bickered and squabbled about being able to sit in the viewing gallery to see Alma and George on trial. A short while into the trial, Alma retracted her confession, and instead did say that George had confessed to her that he had killed Francis. George too didn't even try to stand up for himself and did confirm that he had indeed killed the man, but his defence thought that this was just an awful situation he'd found himself caught up in, and so instead they tried to use an alibi of drug addiction to save him. However, the prosecution sniffed out that this was indeed an elaborate padding of the situation, and when George was asked about the drugs he'd been taking, he couldn't even identify what they were correctly and gave wild, overdose-inducing amounts of what he had taken, all of which pointed to a man who'd never had anything to do with drugs. Other damning reports of Alma and her behaviour were tried by the defence to implicate her, saying she had a wild and out-of-control drug habit, and whilst the family doctor did reveal that Alma was occasionally treated with morphia and sometimes cocaine, it painted a picture of a person using what were prescribable drugs to assist them infrequently and at the suggestion of a doctor, not an addict who was out of control. Eventually, it was very clear to everyone in the jury that this was a crime of passion, something which Alma had not asked of George, and that he himself was also a victim of circumstance. After just 5 days, the jury delivered a verdict of not guilty for Alma, but George was not so lucky. He was convicted for the murder of Francis Mawson Rattenbury, but the jury did also deliver a plea for mercy for the teenage boy. But the law being what it was, the judge had no other option but to sentence George Stoner to death. Alma, now free to return home, found herself entirely overcome with grief and was bereft that she'd managed to embroil a boy who had his whole life ahead of him in a situation that was out of her own making. She decided there was only one thing left that she could do that might help George escape the noose. On the 4th of June 1935, Alma boarded a train to Christchurch, a 30-minute trip. She stopped in a hardware store, bought a knife, and walked to the River Stour. In a calm and peaceful meadow, she walked towards the water, stood on the edge of the riverbank, thrust the knife into her chest 6 times, and fell into the water. Alma decided that the only way she had a chance of giving George a chance at life was if she was to pay for his crimes with her own. 37-year-old Alma Rattenbury died on the 4th of June 1935. Her body was found floating in the River Stour by a local farmer. She left behind her 2 children, John and Christopher, and in a diary she wrote that she hoped she and the whole event would be forgotten in the hopes that her children wouldn't have to live in the shadow of her mistakes. Both Francis and Alma were buried in the same cemetery in Wimborne Road in Bournemouth, but not in the same grave. Interestingly, Francis wasn't given a headstone, but Alma was. Only in 2007 was Francis eventually honoured with a grave marker. Alma's funeral was attended by over 3,000 mourners. The crowd was mainly made up of women. The story of Alma had touched many women who could relate to at least some of the struggles she'd gone through, and they felt sorry that she'd decided to give her life in order to save George's. However, in the eyes of the law, this act of selflessness didn't actually have any standing, but the general public made their voices heard on behalf of Alma. Alongside the merciful jury, who believed that George didn't deserve the death penalty initially, the general public signed a petition in their thousands to be sent to the Home Secretary with a plea to reduce George's death sentence to life imprisonment instead. The plea worked, and George was removed from the execution list for June that year and instead given a life sentence. After World War I, people were beginning to realise that the death penalty may have been majorly flawed, and that cases like the Rattenburys and Stoners were complex and multifaceted, and that death was not always the answer. The public sentiment was changing towards prisoners, and as so many people had lost loved ones in the war, they had become sick and tired of death. This victory for George did a lot to reframe the argument around the death penalty and would be used to strengthen the case towards its abolishment in subsequent years. As for George, war would actually help him. When World War II came along, a select number of prisoners were given an ultimatum. If they were willing to fight in the army, they could be released from prison. George accepted the offer, and only after serving 7 years of his sentence, he was allowed out. George survived the war, went on to marry and have a family of his own, and lived a relatively quiet life. Sadly, as his years advanced, he developed dementia, and this resulted in him being arrested for indecent exposure against a minor in a public toilet, but this act was subsequently attributed to his illness. George died at the age of 83 in the year 2000. He proclaimed that Alma was the one who really murdered Francis, and he maintained his innocence for the rest of his life. The murder of Francis Rattenbury, to us nowadays, seems like something entirely avoidable, but the circumstances under which it occurred was a snowball effect of a society which cared too much about the way things appeared to other people. Had Francis and Alma not been bothered about going through another divorce, they could have amicably parted ways. Francis could have retired happily by the sea, and Alma could have moved on, found an age-appropriate partner, and they both would have been happy in their own ways. However, society doomed Francis to death. If George hadn't murdered the old man, he would have killed himself via his alcoholism, something which was brought on by the pressure to maintain a young wife he'd mentally lost, and to cope with the downfall of his once burgeoning architecture career. George was caught in the middle of a messy marriage, which in all reality had nothing to do with him. He was used as a pawn by Alma to make her declining husband notice her, but ultimately she was seeking escapism from a life which no longer fulfilled her, and she felt trapped. The teenage boy, in his naive way, thought he would be solving all of Alma's problems by taking Francis out of the equation. But little did George realise it was never him she wanted. She wanted Francis, but he'd given up on life, and in a world without him, she too had no other option but to do the same. The Villa Madeira, which was changed back to plain old Five Manor Road once it was left abandoned, was often looted by those interested in obtaining keepsakes from the infamous residence. The property, which was taken on by a family in the 1940s, was kept within their family up until this year when it went on the market and was sold. Interestingly, the interior was kept fairly similar to how the Rattenburys would have had it when they lived there, and when the subsequent owners were asked why, they said they could often feel Alma still around and that she enjoyed the home. They used to light a candle on the day of Francis's death and would make decisions within the home, like what colour of flowers Alma would like in the garden. They truly felt the home, even though it was theirs, was still shared with the Rattenburys. Hopefully the new owners are aware of the history of the home and that they opt to keep a space for Alma and Francis somehow, if they're still visiting from time to time. Or maybe after all these years and a change in ownership, the Rattenbury family can finally rest. In Alma's last letter, which she wrote before she died, she said, "It's so peaceful here." And I hope she at last has managed to find that, in whatever form it may take. And that she is no longer roaming the Villa Madeira, looking for her life that never was. Thanks for being patient for this one. I didn't intend to take a break after the last episode, but unfortunately time ran away with me and I've been so busy, and I also had a cheeky little holiday. So everything fell apart and I ran out of time to get this one to you when it should have been out. So I'm sorry about that, but I'm now back on it and looking forward to making more episodes. I've been loving the episodes I've been making recently, but as I hope you can tell, they're requiring a lot more effort. So if you want to help me out and to say thank you for all that hard work in return for some extra content, then do please check out my Patreon, where you can catch up on my other podcast, which comes out on the opposite week to the regular episodes. Having a Problem is lots of silly historical-based fun, which usually descends into chaos, so if you fancy something a little bit different, but still with a familiar face, then make sure to check out patreon.com/Macabre London, or click the link in the description. There's no harm in looking, is there? Go on, I know you're curious, and I may have just made one of those episodes over there public if you want to give it a listen and try before you buy. It's the episode all about spiders. If you're interested in the faces behind the names in the episodes, then do please head over to YouTube to take a look at these episodes if you've not yet done so. You get to see many of the people I talk about and the places in the story, plus me hosting the show as well. Just search for Macabre London Podcast and I'll pop up, and make sure you say hi in the comments too. A big thanks to my amazing top-tier legendary executive Patreon producers, Christina, Christoph, Lisa, Mary, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry, Teresa and Veronica, and all of our other fantastic patrons too. If you'd also like your name read out by me at the end of every episode, or your name in the show notes, then signing up to Patreon is the way to make that happen. I hope to see you over there at patreon.com/Macabre London, so I can personally welcome you to the Gore Gang. And lastly, a huge thanks to London Nootropics for sponsoring this episode. Make sure you head over to londonnootropics.com and use the discount code MACABRE for 20% off your order, so you can start on your adaptogenic journey and perk up your brain. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from London's past. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time.